Okay, this is the, I think, third of the clips, and I was finishing up speaking about intensive outpatient programming and that whole category of medical interventions. One thing that's not mentioned in the book, which I think is a big thing to have left out, and maybe it's covered later in the chapter with some of the other drug addictive, the information with the drugs, is medication-assisted treatment. And this is what is used for people who are addicted to many different kinds of medications. Painkillers obviously comes to mind immediately because that's such a terrible rampant thing in our culture. And so this is where people might be, receiving drugs that are less destructive for them in lieu of using their OxyContin or other kinds of things. And so methadone, another one is Suboxone. There are several, I think, medications that are used. These are medications that help a person wean off their very severe addiction to opiates, and these are opiate-like substances that are used to help the person with the withdrawal. And so, Matt Lawson and other of our students, graduates, have worked at and do work at Pinehurst Treatment Center, which is a building right at the traffic circle in Pinehurst that you wouldn't know is what it is, but it is a treatment center for people who go every day and get a medical dose of an alternate drug, and that dose has to be titrated properly and under medical supervision, actually, and then over time the person's dose is reduced, and it is hoped that eventually the person who was addicted can not use even the medical alternate medicine. But sometimes people actually just continue really for a really long time using the medical assisted substitute substances. So that is something that you should know about, and I thought I should mention it in this section. Loved ones of substance abusers need to understand themselves in relation to addiction. And so what is often called a group of enabling behaviors is a rich group of principles of interaction with someone who's an active substance abuser. These are behaviors that are used that enable the person who is a user or living in addiction to continue to do that behavior. And so I'm stumbling around a little bit because I do know that people who are in recovery and who are sponsoring other people also try to recognize when they're using enabling behaviors to someone that they're sponsoring. So it's not just family members who must beware of using enabling behaviors, but in this part of our discussion, I do want to make sure you're understanding that family members can use a big dose of education and understanding about their own way of interacting with their loved one who is a substance abuser. And the textbook does give us some information about enabling behaviors, but I'll give you a couple of examples that are really common. One would be to loan the person money or let the person have money so that they can continue using. One would be to allow a person to live with you even if they're not keeping their employment and they are living in active addiction. Another one would be to be calling the person's employer if they're too sick to go to work, or they're too intoxicated to go to work, or too hungover to go to work. This whole constellation of covering up for someone is an enabling behavior. And so families really, end up kind of employing these behaviors almost as a default, because it's hard to know what to do actually when someone that you love is clearly addicted and abusing substances. And you don't get any advice or learning or education about it. I think it's probably pretty normal to just fall into these enabling behaviors. And so, this kind of enabling really just sets up the person who's living in active addiction to just keep using. They really are not receiving any consequences for their addiction, except for feeling kind of miserable. And so they're getting fed, they have a place to live, they have people who are caring and loving them and maybe pitying them or being angry at them. Sometimes even just engaging in fighting and angry outbursts with the person who is addicted is helpful to help them maintain their addiction. And part of that is because then they can just feel mad and feel attacked, and then just use that as a defense mechanism to not really cope with the effects that their addiction is having on themselves and certainly the people they love. So here's a really interesting thing to understand about persons who live with people who are living in active addiction. And this kind of leads us into a whole discussion about codependent behavior. So codependence is a term that was coined probably in the early 1980s. There was a lot of literature and there were a lot of books, self-help books, that were published at that time about how people who love addicts or alcoholics, the way that they act that is absolutely just enabling of the addictive behavior. And codependence can really come out of having lived or grown up in a home where addiction happened also. And so, addiction is so destructive to a family structure and so destructive to parenting behavior that children who grow up in a home where addiction is active and happening, that the children then develop certain behaviors for survival. And so they become over-responsible. They may love learning to be in control because everything else around them is out of control. And they may become super organized and super responsible and sort of holier than thou, actually. So all of this constellation of coping behaviors can drive a person in young adulthood to, when they start to look for someone to be in love with, to be in love with somebody who needs those kinds of skills. And it feels like a love relationship, obviously, because the people we love who are substance abusers are still wonderful people, right? But also this mimics the first love relationship that we have if it's with somebody, if we have a parent or a caregiver who is an active substance abuser. And so this is very, very powerful dynamic. And interestingly, the people who become codependent people live with the very same emotions that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this lecture. They live with resentment, they live with fear, they live with low self-esteem, they live with anger, they live with guilt, definitely guilt, and shame. And so this whole constellation that the abuser has as a part of their emotional makeup is exactly mirrored in someone who is a codependent. And so I just can only think about how very, very powerful that is. Well, the good news obviously is that someone who is a codependent person and using these enabling behaviors can be educated to learn what those are, why they exist, why they have them as a part of their personality, and then what to do about it. And this kind of thing can be managed in family therapy. It can be managed through reading books about codependency. It can be managed through having a person attend Al-Anon meetings where they understand and learn all about these kinds of dynamics. And so I just can't emphasize enough how important treatment for the codependent person is. And in a crisis, for you as a crisis counselor to understand that there's hope for the person who loves the substance abuser is a very, very positive and powerful thing to offer to someone who's feeling this kind of despair and like their life is falling apart and they just can't do it anymore. So I will end our discussion about this, excuse me, by telling you that some of the techniques that we've talked about in class all along, such as empowerment statements, you can see how an empowerment statement could be used for a person who's codependent or a family member. You can see how using education statements here are very, very powerful for providing hope and information. Referring people for real therapy or video therapy about these topics, or for reading not textbooks, but popular books about these topics can all be a part of that education statement. Universalizing, offering empathy and acceptance are all reframing. All of these kinds of things can be very helpful techniques to use for either the person who is the substance abuser or the person who loves the substance abuser. So I hope this has been a helpful chapter for you, and I hope you have a great day.